Hi, I'm Mellisa Smith.
I'm Spencer Ziegler, and welcome to Data Lit, a podcast by educators for educators. So, Mellisa, we are recording this just a couple days before spring starts.
I.e. pollen season?
Yes, well, and that might be the first answer. So, I was wondering, what are some things that you associate with spring? So, pollen.
Yes, a yellowing of the earth.
Yeah, but with that, flowers. What else?
Birds.
Birds, yeah.
So my daughter and I were talking recently how we kind of miss, like this time of year, you kind of look, at least for me, we look forward to hearing the birds. There's some birds that sort of land at the edge of our roof near our bedrooms.
Yeah.
And you can hear them. And that's usually the sign for us, it's time to wake up.
Oh, yeah, that is a nice alarm, yeah. I had a house back, there was a rooster nearby. That was a less pleasant alarm. But yeah, birds, that's nice. That's nice, yeah.
Growing up in the Caribbean, yes, roosters, but they are not waking up at the time when I want to wake up. They are waking up way too early.
Yeah. Baseball for me,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And of course, I think the big one, our listeners are probably screaming into their stereo, the big sign of spring.
Is it a T word?
Standardized testing.
Yeah.
Yes, of course. So we're going to, as we wind down season 5, Data Lit, we're going to talk a little bit about standardized testing.
Yay.
And last year, one of my favorite episodes that we've done was that history of standardized testing.
Yes, yeah.
I thought it was really fun to kind of research what it looked like over the years in America.
Mm-hmm.
So we thought we would kind of extend that a little bit and look at what standardized testing might look like across the globe in some other countries.
Yep.
Yeah. So what we're going to do, so I mentioned we're recording this in, mid-March, but the episode isn't coming out till a bit later because we're going to assign each other 2 countries to go and research.
Okay.
And then we're going to come back in, a week or two, and you and I are going to sit down and we're going to share research with each other, just what we learned. So, okay, let's go do like draft style. So here, you can go first. Give me a country.
All right. So looking at my Tim's list, we're going to start with Finland.
Finland. Okay. I'm excited because I just know a little bit, just you always get those comparisons.
Yes.
With the Tims. I think that'll be good.
Okay.
Okay. And I'm going to give you, just because I've seen it pop up, some stories, but I don't know too much about it. So you can teach me about South Africa. Yes.
Okay. Cool.
Okay. What's my other one then?
All right. This one is definite. I think we're going to find a lot. Singapore. Yes.
Because that's another one you oftentimes get that.
Yes.
Singapore, you see X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
Okay. That's good. All right. And the other one, I'm intrigued kind of historically.
Okay.
So another country, former British colony, kind of split off. You got Australia.
Okay.
It's a huge landmass.
I might come back with a new accent, but let's see.
Can I hear? Let me hear it.
Blimey? No.
Nailed it. I'm also assigning, you have to watch Crocodile Dundee and 17 episodes of Bluey before we record again.
Oh, that
Bluey's
is so right.
Yeah. Okay.
My daughter is a Bluey fan. So.
Okay. I really do.
I might actually wear my Bluey hoodie that she made for me.
Do that. Yeah, please wear that.
Okay.
Okay. So, we're going to pause.
All right.
And for listeners, it'll just be, a few seconds, a little interstitial music. But for us, it'll be a week or two. And we'll come back to share what we learned.
All right.
Okay, you ready?
Sounds good. Let's go.
And we're back. All right. Did you enjoy your researching, Mellisa?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating to always read about how other countries are testing, right? There are times when you're so isolated that you think that testing and testing woes are only happening here in the U.S.
Yep.
What about you?
Yeah, same. It was intriguing. My two, there are similarities and differences with each other and also with the United States.
Yeah.
All right. Which one of your countries do you want to chat about first? We'll alternate back and forth.
I'm going to start with South Africa because I think that one was the most interesting one. So in South Africa, their governing body is called the Department of Basic Education. And it seems that they have 2 sort of standardized tests. There's one called the National Senior Certificate, NSC. And then later on, there seemed to be the annual national assessments, ANAs.
Okay, so ANA kind of every year after a certain grade or so? And then the big one is the acronym, I forget?
Not quite. So up until 1996, the only standardized test that they had was the NSC, the National Senior Certificate, right? And that sort of tested students in their final year of high school, like equivalent to our grade 12. And they are seen as what we call a matriculation exam because it's used as an indicator of performance and entry into higher ed. The downside of that is it provided very little information about performance prior to, like in their primary school sort of years.
Right.
Which is why I guess they decided, we need something else to sort of see where students are so that if we need to make changes as a country, we can do so much sooner, like in the primary years, as opposed to just waiting until grade 12. And that's how the ANAs, the Annual National Assessments, came about. And so those are done in grades 1 through 6.
Interesting.
Yeah. And then in 9th grade, focusing primarily on literacy and numeracy skills. All right. And so the goal, again, was to kind of have a test where we can see where students are in terms of performance in those two basic areas, like reading and arithmetic is the two R's, and use that information to make changes, help teachers, do all that sort of thing. What is interesting is, as one of their newer assessments, it seems that they had issues that we also see in the kinds of things that we have. So one of them being they felt as though the ANAs had limited credibility because there were reports about either cheating or lenient scoring because the scoring is done locally at local schools. So that was sort of interesting. And then another one was the other thing that they seem to be working on is teachers did not see the value in it in terms of the data that it provided did not give teachers felt as though, I still don't know anything about my students. Like, it's not giving me this sort of great aha information, like how we have our standardized tests. When you get that one score, it doesn't tell me, it's not a diagnostic.
Yeah. So is that the purpose? Goes back to our episode last year on the history of standardized testing. The purpose is more this kind of big picture. Are we on the right track? Are the programs, policies, those kind of things? But it's not necessarily meant to primarily say, how should I teach this unit, this standard differently next year?
And so it was interesting to see that the country, I think they had really good intentions. But as we've discussed several times on this podcast, summative assessments are limited in what they can and cannot do, right? So if you want something that can give teachers and students information that they can improve either teaching or learning skills, we've seen time and time again that summative assessments, even though they're standardized, are not the best way to do so. All right. So what about you? What's your...
Actually, can I start with Finland? Because I think there are some interesting connections between that and South Africa.
Okay.
So a lot of my research came from this really good website that I looked into. They had my two countries, but not yours. Sorry about that when we did the draw. But the National Center on Education and the Economy, and we'll drop that in the show notes. Now, first, just some context. The country as a whole is 5.6 million.
Okay.
So, like North Carolina is 11 million. So when we're like, my head goes to like Finland versus the United States, when really the more comparable thing is more like North Carolina. And that's even still, we have twice the population.
Yeah.
And kind of start by looking at some of the context with the PISA, the Program for International Student Assessment. And Finland, as of 2022, was pretty close to the U.S. In math, they were a little bit higher, just a few points. In reading, we were a little bit higher. In science, they were a little bit higher, but it was pretty neck and neck. In all those areas, they were just a tad above the kind of average of all the countries that are taking the PISA.
Okay.
With that said, there's been a drop. There was a drop in 2015 for their results compared to their previous ones, then a little bit more of a drop in 2018, then a drop in 2022. So they're
after
kind of
pandemic.
which, variables there. But and this is also mirrored on some of their local exams. So they've been kind of switching up some of their systems in response. The response and kind of the narrative with Finland is kind of gradually, it's been a very decentralized education system. And they're gradually adding in some more of that centralization for kind of similar reasons like we saw with South Africa. So, for instance, it wasn't until the 70s that they had really a basic comprehensive school system for all students through grade 8. It was kind of a little bit more fragmented before then.
Oh.
And the 80s was the first time that they had some kind of common curriculum. And even then, there's a lot of autonomy at the local level in terms of how you implement and supplement all those kind of things.
Oh, okay.
So yet their structure, they have a Ministry of Education and Culture, and that's going to oversee all publicly funded education. So core curriculum, teacher training programs, those kind of things.
Yeah.
And then it's split into 6 regions, but a lot of local control in the 300 municipalities. So that's where like funding allocations, creating local curricula, teacher recruitment, appointing principals for 6 and 7 year terms, all those kind of things. I mean, the funding, it's about 40% that's central government and 60% that like municipality. So now in terms of like the standardized testing, they have this, in 2013, it was established, this independent agency, the Finnish Education Evaluation Center. So the Ministry of Education appoints researchers, teachers, and principals to this group, but then they're an independent branch.
Okay.
So they do like thematic evaluations, they do learning outcomes. They also do examinations on a kind of a national level with a sampling of students in grade 9 in Finnish and math, and those take place every 3 years, then other subjects every 5. So kind of NAEP-like, where that it's not necessarily every kid. When you're working with those representative samples, you can kind of cater it so that it's trying to be as representative and inform what you want. So I thought that was interesting that they do the sampling approach for their big kind of assessment. And then they write up these reports for that with non-binding recommendations. So really like their kind of version of maybe DRA or NCDPI's accountability system.
Were you just in recommendations?
Yeah, but as an independent kind of entity, which is interesting. So I mentioned there's, a national core curriculum, and they require every basic school, which is through grade 9, to provide students with a report on their academic progress at the end of each year. But there's some autonomy with what this looks like. Before 2021, and again, that's when the PISA scores and some of those were a little bit stronger, there was a lot of choice, and a lot of schools were actually doing verbal assessments for that. But since then, you're seeing more and more doing some kind of numerical grading system because they're seeking consistency in feedback.
Okay.
So there's conversations we've had throughout this podcast of the different, assessment methods, and then it's easier to have that quicker and that one version of reliability and validity with selective response than say personal communication. So you're seeing a shift to some of those. And then you have a more kind of standardized assessment at the end of basic education, at the end of grade 9. So it's kind of like their elementary and middle schools kind of batched together. And then that's that kind of turning point. So each subject has one of these, and you have a 10-point scale with like 5 being the cut score for passing. You have decentralized scoring, so it's on the local level because you have extended response. You have essays in there.
Oh, wow.
But again, more recently, they're trying to come up with guidance with exemplars, with the like anchor text to kind of say like, hey, here's what an 8 should look like, some of those kind of things.
Okay.
So if you pass all of those, then you get a certificate, and then you kind of choose that high school, if you will, track, be it academic or vocational. And then at the end of their version of kind of high school, upper secondary, you have a matriculation exam. So similar to South Africa.
Yep.
And this is, getting into that university admission. You got in math and Finnish, like that are the main ones. And then you can kind of choose for some of these other 3s. And this is going to consist of multiple choice. So similar to a lot of our standardized assessments, but again, those essays. So in Finland, you have kind of the root of it is this decentralization. And it kind of makes sense when you think of like the geography there. It's just, it's spread out. A lot of people are south, but you still have to serve all those in these more isolated rural communities. But increasing supports and guidance in the face of some slightly slipping scores on the PISA and some of those local assessments. That's Finland.
That was interesting. I don't know, or I wonder if size, right, of a country makes a difference in how reflective they are about their policies, right?
Yep.
So a country like Finland, they're trying to keep tweaking their assessment system to see, is it really working? Is it doing the things that we want to do? It sounds as though a lot of these countries do not typically have an accountability system similar to how we have it or see it in the U.S., where it's tied to either teacher pay or funding or school funding and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if, because they're smaller, it allows them to be a little bit more reflective about their practice in terms of, let me try this. And then, I like how they have this outside board to kind of see, like, is it working?
Yeah.
Is it not working? For whom is it working? What do we need to have to do to tweak? I think that is something that we can learn from as we move forward.
Yeah. Yeah. And to that point, their teacher accountability, like there's no formal teacher evaluations in Finland, and they're not pulling in the test scores. Though municipalities, have the autonomy, and maybe they might do something different, but by and large, they're not. It's more descriptive with a focus on teacher practices than it is like, on this exam, you got X, Y, that puts you in this category, those kind of things.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Let's see. What about Australia? So that's interesting again in terms of population isn't going to be comparable to the US, but just size. It has some of our complexities. What do you learn about Australia?
So equally, I expected, because of previous links to England, that I expected the governing bodies to also be called the Ministry of da-da-da-da-da-da. And so theirs is not called that. It is the Australian Curriculum Assessment and Reporting Authority, or ACARA, maybe that's how you say the acronym. And so they administer something that's called the National Assessment Program in Literacy and Numeracy, or NAPLAN. That is administered to all students in years 3, 5, 7, and 9. So it's interesting that this grade 9 seems to be, again, a little bit of a, I'm trying to equate that to, like, in America, it's like a midway middle school kind of thing, or, it's interesting how they see that as one part of student learning.
Right.
And then you have this other part of student learning. I think that the way they separate those two is interesting.
Yeah.
But that test focuses on essential skills, again, in reading, writing, language conventions, and numeracy. It's criterion reference, and the results of those are used to look at individual student performance. They get school averages to monitor educational outcomes and determine overall proficiency levels. They were, again, designed to kind of help inform parents and teachers about where students are along the way, as opposed to, because they also, too, have a matriculation exam. I think it's called the A-STAR at the end of 12th grade that's used for university placement. But, they have this test looking at these areas to kind of give us a sense of what is happening earlier on so that we can make these changes. Again, some concerns that they have been seeing as the ACARA look, because they also do the same thing too, where they go back from time to time and kind of look at, okay, where we are, maybe there are some things about, are they the persons to examine themselves, but there's still that self-reflection piece. Is it measuring what we think we wanted to measure? Some of the debates have been that when you only look at multiple choice and you only look at numeracy and literacy skills, it doesn't give you a measure of higher order skills. And it's interesting that both in South Africa and in Australia, they talk about it doesn't give you a measure of creativity. And, we just spent some time talking about the 4 C's, and, both countries are saying, well, these tests, they don't tell us everything, especially along the lines of students' creativity or critical thinking, which is interesting, that they both highlighted those 2 C's as being important to measure. Yeah. But, these tests don't give us that. The other thing that in Australia they saw, that the introduction of the NAPLAN sort of saw this new teaching to the tests kind of mindset. And in some countries, teaching to the test is not a bad thing. It is the way that you implement a curriculum. So in a way, teachers are encouraged to teach to the test, or they do teach to the test because that is how you implement the curriculum, which is a different way than we see teaching to the test here. However, they have seen a switch in that it's becoming more of teaching to the test as we see it in America, in terms of that's all you're doing is teaching to the test and getting kids prepared for the test.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. You know, it's, I don't know, if you think of like a game as a summative assessment for a sports team or something, no one would be like, oh, you practice for the game. Like, of course. But then when you accept, especially going off like the fourth season, those kind of things, that these assessments were not meant to measure all the skills that our students need, then if you take it too far and you teach to the test at the neglect of some of these other standards that are also part of your job, then it's when it becomes problematic.
And I think too, I find it also interesting that all of these national standardized tests are only, again, focusing on our kids' numeracy and literacy skills. Yeah. Again, very important. But over the years, I haven't heard of a lot of emphasis on other subject areas. Like, you know, we in the US, we talk about, we have 4 content areas. You know, there is social studies and science. There's not a lot of emphasis. We still, that's still literacy and numeracy is still the big factors in all of these.
Yeah, that cycle that can either be virtuous or vicious about like the assessment informs the teaching, which informs the assessment. That can be helpful for developing the skills that's being assessed.
Yeah.
But then if things are not assessed there, then does it just get discarded, you know?
And I do understand that, you know, in the early years, those 2 areas are very important, right? In a student's development. But if that's the only thing we look at, how does that later affect, you know, what we're trying to see as they get older?
True.
I think another thing that they struggle with is the delay between when the tests are given and when the results are given.
Sure. Yeah.
Again, we see that here in the US when you have these big standardized summative assessments, you know, and I think what South Africa is looking at, you want to make sure that there's rigor. You want to make sure there is consistency in the administration. You want to make sure that there's consistency in the testing and the scoring. When you're trying to do all of those things, time is passing. And if the results are meant for teachers to inform their teaching practice, by the time they get the results back, the kids have either moved on, either in grade level, or the teacher has moved on in terms of the topic. And so that is one of their struggles, again, about how can we administer these. They are looking at having the test online, and will that, you know, help them get the results faster? But again, that is something that they are looking at, you know, as they look at these assessments. The time that it takes is a factor when you say that the purpose of these assessments is to inform teaching and learning.
Right, as opposed to going the sampling route where there's not that demand, you know? Interesting.
All right. What was your last country? Singapore?
Singapore, yeah.
All right.
So, yeah, and there's some interesting connections there with Australia, because I found that they were influenced by their prior relationship with the UK a little bit more.
Okay.
So in terms of the PISA, they've been quite a bit higher than the United States historically, and the other OECD countries participating in this exam. So for instance, mathematics, we were at 465 in 2022. They're at like 575, about at the top there. The average was 472, so much closer to us. Reading, you know, we're at 504. The average was at 476. They're at 543. Science, we were at 499. The average was 485. They're at 561. And pretty much right in line with where they were scoring before the pandemic in 2018 as well.
Okay.
So they've historically done pretty well. With that said, their approach recently, at least based on like the plans on those kind of things, is to try to, you know, I have a quote from their education minister, Ong Ye Kung, saying learning is not a competition, and that they're trying to discourage comparisons between student performance and encouraging individuals to concentrate on their learning development.
Now that's interesting.
Yeah, so they
because I know the reason why we switched to, or there was such a heavy emphasis on Singapore math in the U.S. is because we saw it as a competition. We were trying to make sure, how is it that countries like Singapore are beating us when we see ourselves as having all of these resources. So what is it that we are doing? So we saw learning as a competition. So it's interesting that their minister is saying learning is not a competition.
Yeah, and this has been the emphasis for a while. In 2004, they developed the Teach Less, Learn More initiative, which was trying to focus less on rote memorization and repetitive tasks and more towards deeper conceptual understanding and problem-based learning. They have this big Every School's a Good School initiative that's trying to make sure that resources are allocated equitably based on need. And they have this Learn for Life initiative in 2018 that's looking at flexibility in teaching, learning, and assessment and trying to get more self-directed learning. Now, all of this, Singapore was quite different from Finland because all this is very, very centralized. So they have a Ministry of Education, which oversees kindergarten, which is ages 4 or 5 there, through higher education, even lifelong learning.
Yeah.
And they're allocating funding for all the schools. They're setting the course syllabi, the national exams, the teacher credentialing, evaluations, promotion systems. They're doing the hiring and assigning of principals, all these kind of things.
Yep.
Now, I should step back again. This is a densely populated country with a population of like 6 million. And again, North Carolina is like 11.
Yeah.
So there are things that you can do when everybody's close and the numbers aren't astronomically high.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they have this really centralized Ministry of Education, but like Finland, their assessment board is independent. So they have the Singapore Examinations and Assessment Board, which is kind of comparable to, North Carolina Department of Public Instruction's Accountability Department or our DRA. And it was established in 2004 as a statutory board. It's doing test administration, doing training about those assessments, putting out the reports, all those kind of things. Their quote is, "We aim to become a regional center for assessment products and services and contribute to Singapore's development as an educational hub." And so it's a lot of like when you go to like NC Test and you have all these kind of resources to the point where when you go to their website, there is a tile there for train disruption advice. Just like if the train is late or a kid misses their train, how do you respond? So very, very detailed, like misadministration, all those kind of things. It's going through this independent board. So now those exams, you have, their primary school, they have this PSLE, primary school leaving exam. So around the age of 12, so similar to that kind of grade 9 cutoff that we've seen with each of these. And it's meant to kind of make sure that kids are getting the appropriate secondary school courses. And so you have these kind of subject-based, like English, math, science, whatever their mother tongue might be. And so you get a collection of subscores with sums between like 4 and 32. So it kind of felt like ACT-ish a little bit. And then where they fell there determines what options might be available. Combination of selected response, but then also that extended response in the oral communication, which allows you to start to get into some of those other skills that are harder to measure with selected response, but gets a little bit trickier for, some of that validity and all those kind of elements. And in the last few years, they're switching over from norm referenced, where again, that's like percentile kid versus kid, to criterion reference. Again, so criterion reference, based on the standards, again, trying to get less the competitive element and more so each kid getting what they need. Secondary level, then you have the GCE, the General Certificate of Education. And this came through a partnership with Cambridge University for years. It was really delinked from the UK in the 2000s.
Oh, okay.
But there's still collaboration there. And this was... It gets complicated, so I apologize if we lose listeners, but there are different levels there, like the N, the normal, be it technical or academic, then the ordinary level, the advanced level. And essentially, it's just as you move further up, you have these different ones, but they're all rooted in this collaboration with Cambridge.
Nice.
Historically. And that's going to determine like university admissions, all those kind of things. 2027, they're switching the N and O levels to a more new comprehensive Singapore Cambridge Secondary Education Certificate, an SEC. So they're constantly kind of tinkering, and they've cut off from the UK, but they're still collaborating with Cambridge with this. They also have centralized interim assessments throughout. but they recently dropped their mid-year kind of assessment.
So it's only a beginning and an end?
I think, I'm not sure the number, but it felt more like NC check-in for me than like what we might think of as like, I don't, on the course level, sometimes you might have the mid-unit assessment that's kind of summative-ish, and more so they want it to be these interims to be more formative kind of thing.
Okay.
So yeah, so they have a number of different assessments, and all of them very centrally kind of planned and administered through a collaboration with the Ministry of Education, but then this independent kind of assessment accountability board. And these are the data is used to inform kind of instruction and planning, all those kind of things. But it didn't seem quite as prominent in their accountability measures. Like their school accountability system, it's called School Excellence Model. It's got 9 criteria, including like school visits are a big part of it. It's not just like, here are the test results, here's where you are. Teacher accountability, there's like 16 competencies. And there's a lot of like qualitative descriptive feedback as opposed to like evaluations and here's where your numbers kind of fell, all those kind of things. So the data, the assessment data is a part, but not a necessarily prominent part.
All right. It's not the driver.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's essentially Singapore, very centralized, a lot of kind of tinkering with it there, but more and more kind of doing the opposite of what we see a lot of other places and like, let's focus less on that competition and more on that like self-directed kind of thing.
I think that's very fascinating. Again, after the TIMS are in the early 2000s, when I was doing more math ed research, there was that pressure almost that in the US, we needed to do more to catch up to some of our Asian countries. And so it's interesting to see that. And one of the things we kind of discussed back then is how does mindset play a role in it? Like, in some of these Asian communities, it was brought up that they are super competitive, right? That kids are going to school almost 6 days a week, trying to keep up. It's a lot of pressure, a lot of high stakes. And that's different here in the US. And so what role does that mindset play when we're trying to figure out what is it that we need to do to sort of keep up with some other countries? So it's interesting to see that they're seeing that as a need to change.
Yeah. And it's, it makes me think of conversations we've had countless times about like the different data types, student learning, demographic, perception, and then process. And one thing we've stressed is the value of the process data, knowing what the steps people took to get there.
Yeah.
So that one, you can kind of look at those process data that result in student learning, think about, are those steps that we want to take? And also just, is that our assumption about how they got there? Like as we look at Singapore and be like, oh, they've actually been kind of focusing less on some of the stuff that we might be assuming they're focusing on.
Right, yeah. That's a good point. I think another thing in my research that I found that came up when I was looking at South Africa was, the role that politics can play when you have a national kind of system, right?
Yeah.
So, a little bit was mentioned about how did their educational system change after apartheid ended. And then, during apartheid, there is kind of like these two school systems sort of operating. And then after that, how do you merge the two? And even though they're merging, you just can't just put them together and everything works. And so one of the things that they sort of looked at is in some of the areas that were poorer, because, they didn't have the resources, they continued to be poorer even after apartheid. Right. And so what role does it play? What role does economics play in our education system, right? We're having all of these assessments, but is it fair to assess us the same way you're assessing other people when we don't have the resources that other people have? Yeah,
inspecting the opportunities for each, inspecting the curriculum, making sure there's not biases in those assessments that you're using as these dipsticks, all those kind of things. And that kind of speaks to just what standardized assessment can illuminate when you have all the kids taking the same tests, but then the importance of kind of stepping back and saying, what was it meant to measure? What was it not meant to measure? All those kind of pieces.
And then too, when I was looking at Australia, in some Australian schools, like we have here in North Carolina, they're able to select the students that they want to attend their school.
Ooh, right. Yeah.
And so there are questions about should they be given the same test or judged the same way as a school that has to take in all students.
Yep.
With all backgrounds. Again, and we also have similar things where not that, I guess in terms of our application schools, right? You're applying, but I mean, are all schools really the same when you're looking at nationally? Is everybody the same? Like all of their students the same, all of their teachers the same, the resources they get the same. We know when we're trying to measure them and saying, okay, put them up against this assessment, the idea of what is the same, it really comes into question. So I think that's, it was interesting to see that those ideas and notions and that are the same, not only in our country, but in other countries as well, as we try to figure out what do we need to do to make it that it's fair and equitable for everyone.
Yeah, well put. Yeah, and that's kind of, the value of travel, right? You go and you see the world and you learn about these different places, but you come back with different ideas about your home.
Yeah.
I kind of felt this with our research-based travel for this. Listeners, just let us know anything that we missed, anything that you've learned about some of these countries that you want to kind of share, and we can read those out on air. You can contact us at datalit@wcpss.net. And you can go to our website at www.wcpss.net/datalit to find more resources, to contact us, all that kind of stuff. So thank you, Mellisa, for traveling the globe with me these last couple of weeks.
Yeah, thank you. Next time we're actually going in person, though. See if we can work that in.
We'll see what we can do. And thank you to Ligon High School's Will McElarney for the fantastic theme music. And thank you to you, listeners, for tuning in.
Bye.
Take care.